Good evening, everyone. I will be letting people in at the same time that I'm talking. And if everyone would please mute themselves until after. We can also put any questions into the chat function. So this evening, welcome to the Jenks Center. If you haven't been here before, we are located in Winchester, Massachusetts. We're so happy that you've joined us this evening. So just a little housekeeping. As I was saying, you can put any questions into the chat and we will get to them a little bit later. If you would like to get our e-newsletter happenings, you can go and sign up for that and receive that monthly. Please be advised that this presentation is being recorded. You may be asked to participate in an online survey to meet the requirements of our grant. Okay, so I'm just going to go over what our programming is for July and also August, which hasn't appeared in the website yet. So just so you can jot it down, maybe leave those nights open that look interesting. So Decorating with Color, that is our interior designer, Stacy Martin. That's on July 10th. We have Composer's Corner with host Andrew Celentano and guest Paul Hartung. That's July 13th. The Beatles sing-along with Diane Therese. She's really excellent singer, beautiful, beautiful voice. So you can join along on July 17th. I believe that's a Saturday night. We have the Cape Cod Journals of Henry David Thoreau, presented by historian Richard Smith, who's written many books about him. That is July 20th. We have Car Racing with Jim Shaw. So please check this out. We're going to do. What I was amazed when I was looking at this is that, you know, these car racing videos where he's driving and it's 150 miles per hour and you're sitting in the seat with him. It's just so interesting. So then we'll move along to August programs, how to become a race car driver with a man who races Porsches. And that's August 3rd. He's going to actually show us how we can become a race car driver. Okay, so I'm just going to admit someone. Okay, Walking Winchester series with Cyrus Dallin Art Museum. And this is the Paul Revere statues. He's just very prolific and wonderful artist. Then we have Composer's Corner with guest Bonnie McLeod. And that's August 10th. She is not only pianist, but she's a singer as well. Beautiful voice. We have Budget Decorating Tips and Tricks with Stacy Martin on August 14th. Then we have a real treat on August 17th, Eleanor Roosevelt, the first lady of the world with an actress, Cheryl Faye. So she's going to present that. We have Stretching for Daily Maintenance Workshop with John Saya. So he's really going to teach us what we should do daily to stay in shape. Feng Shui Your Space with Mei Hong. She came last year. She's coming back to add to our knowledge of how to clear the energy and to help us heal through our space. So that brings us to a huge thank you to the Cummings Foundation for their generous grant that got all of these programs started. For the last 3 years, we've been able to partake. And we have just received a 10-year grant from them, so we're so thankful. And that brings us to this evening, which is Summer Backyard Birds with Neil Hayward. And just let me introduce him, give him a little shout out. Neil has been a bird watcher ever since he was strong enough to lift a pair of binoculars on his own. He's a past president of the Brookline Bird Club in Massachusetts, board member of the American Birding Association, council member of the Nuttall Ornithology Club, and bird sightings editor for the journal Bird Observer, and the author of Lost Among the Birds. So thank you so much for being here this evening, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Neil.
Thank you so much, and it's great to be back to see some familiar faces and some new faces as well. So I hope you're all going to enjoy this evening's birding. I have to say, I'm not sure if I can compete against race car driving and sing-along Beatles, but we'll see. Kind of a daunting lineup, but anyway, we'll see. I think birds are pretty fun, so we will do our best to compete with those. Okay, let me share my presentation. Okay, can everyone see that? Yeah. And I should point out, I'm happy to take questions. You can either put them in the chat function or unmute yourself and interrupt me. I have no problems with being interrupted, but often if you wait to the end, then I'll have forgotten the topic, or you may have forgotten the question. So if you have a question that comes to mind, please jump in. I won't think that's rude. I would like questions. Otherwise, it's just an hour of me talking, which might be tedious for some, and me, including me. Okay, let's get going. So we have a lot to talk about. We're going to talk about the breeding cycle of birds. So there was a lot of, I don't know if you've noticed, but birds are pretty quiet at this time of year. You know, in the spring, they were waking you up at 4 o'clock in the morning. They're very loud and busy. And now it seems like they've all sort of disappeared, or they're quieter. In fact, there are more than there were in the spring. It's just that they're busy breeding. And I'm going to talk about the different phases of that. So establishing a territory and courtship, building a nest, laying eggs, nestlings in the nest, and also fledging. It takes birds about 5 or 6 weeks to do that. We're going to try and cover that in an hour. So I've got a lot of information to get through. I hope you can keep up. But please interrupt if I'm going too fast or if you have questions. So I want some terms I'm going to use throughout this, just so you're familiar with them. First of all is clutch, which is sort of the number of eggs in one nest, the sort of total number of eggs in one nest at one time. And brood is essentially the same thing, but when those eggs turn into chicks, or correctly termed nestlings. Nestlings are chicks that are inside the nest. And then fledglings. Fledglings are birds that have left the nest. They've fledged, which means that they've grown their flight feathers. And actually that distinction between nestlings and fledglings is an important one, because if you find fledglings, they're supposed to look scrawny and messy. If you find those birds in your yard, you really should leave them alone. They've left the nest, they're learning to fly. They should be able to cope on their own. Nestlings have fallen out of the nest and will die. Okay, so if they're at this stage where they haven't got flight feathers, if you can find the nest, put the bird back in or move it to a safe place. There's a sort of urban myth about touching birds, and if you touch birds, then birds can smell that, and the parents will never come back. That's just that, an urban myth. That's not true. But if you are around a long time, you might attract predators because they will see you attending to these young birds. So nestlings, if they've fallen out of the nest, you can put them back. Otherwise, you should leave them alone. Okay, so let's talk about territories. A territory is an area that a bird is essentially defending and is relying on for food, water, and shelter. So it provides all these things that a bird needs, or the family of birds needs during the summer. In some cases, that territory can just be the nest. Here's the nest. Here's a colony of great blue herons. They all nest in the same place because nesting spots are in short supply for herons. They need islands or trees covered in water to stop mammalian predators getting to them. So they sort of cluster together with their very small territories, and then they share all their feeding supplies. They share all the water around them. Some birds, like hummingbirds, have separate territories, but then they also have a separate area where they feed, and they may be very territorial over their feeding areas. Hummingbirds are our tiniest bird, and yet probably our most ferocious based on their size. If you have a bunch of hummingbirds in your garden and you've watched them, you'll notice how territorial they are over flowers and over hummingbird feeders. But for the most part, most songbirds have a territory that encloses everything, and it's unique to them. They have a space that has all the food that they need to bring up their young, enough water and shelter from predators, from the sun, from harsh elements. So how big are these territories? Well, something like a ruby-throated hummingbird has a territory of about 1,200 square yards, which is almost 11,000 square feet. So even this tiny little hummingbird needs more living space than most of us have. So that's quite a large area. And it gets larger predictably with the size of the bird. So an American robin, about 2,000 to 10,000 square yards, which is roughly the size of a football field. So if you can imagine the size of a football field, that's the territory that each pair of American robins and their young essentially are defending. And they're relying on to provide food to grow. Bigger birds like red-tailed hawks have a much larger territory. A red-tailed hawk might have a territory up to 2 square miles. There are fewer of those around. They're not as dense as robins, and obviously not as dense as ruby-throated hummingbirds. Now, the exciting part of the talk. Many birds are socially monogamous. That means that they pair up to raise young. They perform parental functions like we do. They bring up their young. Most of them, 90%. About 10% bring up. About 10% of the males aren't responsible at all. And it's just the females that are involved in bringing up the young. But in the vast majority of birds, both parents have a sort of responsibility for bringing up the young. And that's where we get this idea that we look to birds for their faithfulness. They're forming these pair bonds, and they're very loyal towards each other. That was until DNA analysis. When people started looking at the DNA of chicks and eggs in a nest, they discovered a very different story, which is for many species, for example, the northern cardinal, up to 1 in 3 eggs in that nest don't come from the father. And in fact, some of them don't even come from the mother, which is a startling fact. So actually, genetic monogamy, so that's the young coming from the obvious parent, the obvious father and mother, is rather the exception and not the rule. So most birds, the young in the nest, in many nests, those young aren't the contribution from the direct parents. They're from someone else, which means birds are cheating on a grand scale. Even swans and doves, which we think of the most kind of faithful and loving birds, we look at them for sort of examples of fidelity, but apparently not. So the scientific term is extra pair copulation, and both males and females seek this out. So they're both trying to cheat on each other. And they do that because that increases the genetic diversity. They can obviously get more genes, more genetic content from additional males or females outside of their pair bond. And you may have been saddled with a pretty lousy partner. Maybe you're a female, and the best males have gone, and you want some good genes for your young. Or the male that you have is fantastic at raising birds, but he's not particularly attractive, and you want some attractive genes in your young. So some of those I think we can identify as humans. And it's easy. If you've ever seen birds copulating, it takes a couple of seconds, if that. It's very, very quick. So it's very easy for these birds to form these extra pair copulation bonds. But note that a number of males will spend most of the breeding season mate guarding. They're keeping a careful eye on their mate. See these pair of mallards here? That male is keeping a very careful eye on the female to make sure that she doesn't cheat on him. But that's hard because he also wants to cheat on her. So at some point he's going to have to leave her alone so that he can cheat on her. So there's some complex dynamics going on. Females also can control which sperm is used to fertilize the eggs. So they can store sperm for up to a month, if not longer. And they can release it at different times. And they can sort of essentially control which sperm they use to fertilize the eggs. Now, having said all that, there are some birds that are actually incredibly faithful. So although many species do engage in these extra pair copulations, there are many species that are very loyal towards each other. And these are 3 species. Snowy owls form lifelong pair bonds. They will, the only exception to that is when there's a huge abundance of food. These birds eat voles up in the Arctic. And lemmings. And if it's a really big year for lemmings, often a male will have 2 females, have 2 female and nests at the same time because there's just so much food that he can bring. Bald eagles will pair for life unless one of them dies, when the other one will instantly find another partner, or they discover that they can't produce young. So if they're infertile or one of them is infertile, they will split up and try other partners. And black vultures, well, vultures in general, which we don't have a particular liking for, I think. They're not the most attractive of birds, and they're slightly unattractive, and anyway, their habits aren't particularly attractive either. The reason they don't have feathers on their head is because they spend a lot of the time rummaging around in the carcasses of dead animals, and they get blooded heads, so they don't want to get dirty feathers. But these birds are incredibly faithful. They're so faithful that if one of these vultures is found to be engaging in cheating, then the rest of the vultures will attack it violently. And it's probably that stops vultures from doing that, because they know if they get found out, they get in big trouble. There's a whole clan of vultures that will attack them. So rather surprising that that's probably the most faithful of the birds, vultures. Okay, let's say we've got a pair. They've got a territory. The next thing they do is they build a nest. And for most species, it's the female that builds the nest. The male may contribute for some birds, such as woodpeckers, crows, and house sparrows, or he may just select the location. He may decide where the nest is going to be. Cavity nests are popular. There are a number of species of bird that nest in cavities, and by that I mean holes. So can anyone tell me what birds nest in holes?
How about woodpeckers?
Yes, good job. Woodpeckers, anything else?
Chickadees.
Owls.
Chickadees, yes, chickadees do. Owls, yeah, well done.
Barn swallows.
Barn swallows, yes, they will nest in holes as well as kind of create structures, underneath barns. Yep.
Bluebirds?
Very good. Bluebirds. Some of you have seen bluebird nests. Yeah.
Woodpeckers, did we say?
Yeah, woodpeckers.
Okay.
So yeah, and thank you for speaking out because I can't see the chat box. So if you have a question, then do chat because I can't see the chat box. So yeah, woodpeckers are the most important. Might surprise you that there are ducks. Many species of duck actually live in holes. These are wood ducks, and this is a wood duck nest box. Which, if you go to places like Great Meadows or ponds, where sometimes you'll see these nest boxes in the middle of the water, and those are nest boxes for ducks, for wood ducks. Bluebirds, we covered. Purple martins, which is like a swallow. Some of you may have seen these type of gourd structure. They're more common in the south. We're right at the very northern end sort of range of purple martins. Chickadees and owls. And almost all of these high demand for cavities. So there aren't many cavities around in nature. If you're a bird that nests in a hole and you can't make a hole, you're sort of stuck and you're reliant on woodpeckers. Woodpeckers are so important in many habitats because they create cavities. They create nesting holes for other species. Woodpeckers will make at least 2 holes a year. They'll make a hole to breed in, and then they'll create a hole for the winter. And they won't reuse those holes. So they do produce a large number. They don't keep going back to the same hole. Every season, they'll bring up a family in a different hole. They create new ones. And the leftover ones, then, are up for everyone else. They're up for grabs for chickadees, owls, other species that nest in cavities. Chickadees can actually sort of peck out a very small hole. So they can do some excavation. Everything else is really reliant on woodpeckers excavating those holes. Okay, those are cavities. More common, perhaps, for songbirds are these sort of classic cup nests. And they look like cups. American goldfinch, which is about 3 inches across. Not very big. American robin. Robins are bigger, so sort of 3 to 8 inches in diameter. And these tiny hummingbird nests, about an inch in diameter. And that hummingbird nest is made up of lichen. You can see some lichen in there, and spider webs. And just sort of small bits of material. But a lot of it is sort of silky spider web. It sort of links it together. And saliva from the bird as well. And 1 inch in diameter. So very tiny. Many of the smaller birds, like hummingbirds and goldfinches, will nest toward the sort of periphery of a tree. And that's to stop things like squirrels from sort of running along the branch. If they get too far along the branch, then the branch will start falling and the animal will fall off. So they tend to nest towards as far from the trunk as they can on the flimsiest branch that they can manage so that it can't support the weight of some of these predators. Anyone recognize this nest? Yes.
Baltimore Oriole.
Good job. Actually, a couple of people had their hands up. Yes, Baltimore Oriole. And they have a sort of cup nest that's more like a very extended sort of sack. And this is what the male looks like. Many of you will have seen these birds. These are beautiful songsters. Very, very brightly colored, but in the summer they just disappear. It's very hard to see them. They spend a lot of time sort of in the foliage, and even with those bright colors, they sort of tend to disappear. Often
Can they actually sit on that nest?
Yeah, they can, because the female is incubating the egg. So yeah, so it's sort of attached to 3 points above that, three very kind of thin twigs. You can see this is the very end of these branches. And it's sturdy enough for the eggs and for the female to sit in there. And often at the end of the season, as in the fall, when the leaves fall off, you can see these nests exposed. Some of them will make it all the way through the winter. The birds won't reuse them again. They're not strong enough to do that. And there's a social part of building the nest as well. That's part of sort of improving the pair bond between the male and the female, is selecting the nest location and building the nest. They don't go back to the same nest. But this long nest here helps prevent predators from getting into the eggs. Some of you will have seen these types of nests, these platform nests, which are common among birds of prey, like ospreys, which is just essentially just a pile of sticks. That's what they're doing. They're taking sticks and piling them up. Many of these will break sticks off to create, will break branches to create these sticks. Some of them they find on the ground, but other ones they will actively break up to try and create sticks. Red-tailed hawks. This nest takes about a week to make, 4 to 7 days. It's a lot of sticks. Ospreys, it depends. Ospreys will reuse the same nest year in, year out. The same pair will come back to the same nest, and depending on how much of it has fallen off during the winter, sort of determines how many more sticks they need to add to it. Ospreys are summer visitors to us. They winter in Venezuela, the northern coast of South America. So they have quite a migration story. When they come back here, they relocate their nest and they add more sticks onto it. Doves will also make these types of stick nests. And if you've ever seen a mourning dove nest, they're the most pathetic, flimsy nests out there. They spend very little time and very little effort, and often they just fall apart. And there seems to be no correlation between how well a nest you can make and the success of a species, because there are mourning doves everywhere, so clearly they work. Some of those nests survive and young come out of them, but they really are poor excuses for nests. When you compare that to some of the nests like that hummingbirds make, or if I go back to the these types of nests, which take a lot of work, are very intricate. Mourning doves are pretty lazy. And then there are some other nests that really aren't nests. This is a nest on the ground. And anyone recognize what these eggs might be?
Sandpipers?
Close. It's in that family, yes. They are a type of shorebird.
Plovers,
Plovers. Do you know which plover?
the sand.
Piping plover.
Good job. Piping plover. There we are. There's a piping plover.
When
These are
they're at the beach at Plum Island, you can't go on there.
They are. They're a federally protected species, and
Yeah.
that's why a lot of beaches are closed in the summer to protect these birds, because their nests are invisible. I mean, they're absolutely impossible to find, and they don't do anything. They don't really create a nest. It's called a scrape. It's just a sort of shallow depression in the ground, and then the eggs are so cryptically coloured that they blend in. Other birds that nest on the ground don't need to have cryptically coloured eggs because they're just so aggressive. Like this Canada goose doesn't matter that the eggs are bright white, because as you can tell from this picture, you can't get very close to them. They're pretty aggressive in defending their nest. And then our old favourite, the faithful vulture. They don't make any nest at all. They nest in caves or hollow tree trunks. This is a photograph of one at the bottom of a hollow tree trunk. So yeah, they don't put any effort into making nests at all. They just lay on the ground.
Wow.
Is that the same as a turkey?
Well, it's not the same as a turkey. So it's a turkey vulture. It's called a turkey vulture because the head looks a bit like a turkey because it has this sort of bare skin. But a very different type of bird. But yeah, it's named turkey vulture because it sort of has a superficial resemblance to a turkey with some of that red sort of bare skin on the head.
Okay.
So how do they protect it from the predators?
That's a good question. I think they're often in difficult places to get to. Like if they're on a inside a cave on a ledge, that would be hard for a mammal to climb up to, or if it's a long way down, in the bottom of a tree trunk, then maybe that's hard for animals to get down there. I mean, vultures are pretty aggressive, so as long as there's one vulture in there tending to the young or the eggs, they can probably scare most things off.
Mm.
But it does look, I agree, it does look a bit precarious. Nest failure is common. So many nests will fail, and you will probably see nests that have failed and birds that have given up. Especially for cup nests. There are many things that eat birds' eggs, or young birds. Chipmunks, squirrels, raccoons, skunks, opossums, snakes, bears. And especially other birds, things like blue jays will frequently raid nests for eggs. Ravens will do that. So birds try and build their nest in a place where other birds can't see or other animals can't get to. So they're trying to be as quiet and as cryptic as they can, which is why after this sort of blossom of bird song in the spring, when it's so loud, it goes so quiet because birds don't want to give away their location. They're trying to hide. And well, they also don't need to sing because they've formed a pair, so they don't need to find a mate. They found a mate at that point. Any birds that are singing now, are looking for a mate. They weren't successful. They're hoping for maybe a male that's died, and they can take over, that pair. Also, parasites. There are mites that also are problems for birds in nests. If the nest does fail, most pairs will re-nest. They'll probably choose a new location, create a new nest, and attempt that again. And although there are so many, the rate of nest failure is so high, but because birds lay so many eggs, and we'll talk about that in a minute, that sort of makes up for the population. It keeps the population stable. But to keep a population stable, they have to produce large numbers of eggs every year for a long time, because many of their young will not survive. Okay, let's talk about eggs. So it takes about 24 hours from fertilization to egg laying. And if you remember what I said, that the female can hold on to sperm, so she's not relying on mating with a male to create the fertilization event. That can be later. So she can hold on to the sperm, and then she can release that sperm inside her, fertilize the egg. And from that point, it takes about 24 hours then to lay the egg. The eggshell is the last thing that's added to the egg. And that's where the color of the egg is added at the same time to the eggshell. And most birds will lay one egg a day. So every day, usually in the morning, they'll lay an egg until they get to the full clutch. So depending on how many eggs they're going to lay, they wait until they get to that number. And then the female will start incubating. And she does that to make sure that all of the young are essentially the same age when they hatch, the same developmental age when they hatch. You don't have older ones and younger ones, because the older ones will then outcompete the younger ones. So she's trying to make it sort of balanced so that all of them have a fair chance. So she lays the eggs, she doesn't sit on them, she doesn't incubate them, the eggs are cold, and then when all of them are laid to the right number, she will start incubating them. Now that's not true for birds of prey, where they deliberately do the opposite. As soon as birds like peregrine falcons lay the first egg, they will incubate that. And that means that for something like a peregrine, which is laying 3 or 4 eggs, by the time you get to the 4th egg and that one hatches, it's much younger than all the other ones. And that's sort of an insurance one. Most of the time that young bird is eaten by the other chicks. So it's sort of like an extra food supply. But, on the assumption that food is going to be poor that year. But if it's a fantastic year and the parents have got lots of food, the territory is doing really well, there's an abundance of food, then that young bird might grow up and survive. But it's sort of an insurance that they're sort of banking on it not working. But, if it does, then, hey, we've got an extra chick. Otherwise, it's food for everyone else.
Oh.
So that's birds of prey. That's the opposite of most songbirds, where they wait, the female waits and then incubates them all at the same time.
Okay.
So how many eggs do birds lay? Well, that's the clutch size. So things like waterfowl, ducks, grouse, and by grouse I mean things like pheasants, turkeys, will lay up to about 12 eggs. That's their clutch size. They'll lay 1 egg a day until they get to that. So a wild turkey might take 12 days to lay the clutch, and then we'll start incubating. Birds that nest in cavities, like woodpeckers and this nuthatch, lay up to about 9 eggs. And the cup nesters, things like American robin, about 3 to 6 eggs.
Wow.
Although for hummingbirds, it's always 2. There are like 360 species of hummingbird in the world, and every species of hummingbird lays exactly 2 eggs. All the time. 2 eggs. It fills up that tiny little inch-long nest. And 2 to 3 broods per year is not uncommon. So what does that mean? That means that the female lays these eggs, they hatch into nestlings, and then they leave, and then she does it again. And that's the 2nd brood. And then she'll do it again for the 3rd brood. Many species will essentially breed multiple times in a year, depending on the abundance of food and the weather and a bunch of other conditions. But some species will just breed once a year. They'll have 1 brood, so 1 brood of youngsters. But often they'll try and do 2 or 3 if they can squeeze that in.
There's a question in the chat.
Yeah.
John Brown wants to know, how many seasons does a bird live?
Oh, that's a fantastic question, John. And you've preempted a whole bunch of slides I have on that. So if you can just wait, I'm going to talk about that because that is a really fascinating topic. And I think, yeah, I'm excited to get to that bit. So yeah, I'll get to that at the end. But yeah, how many seasons? Okay, and a bit about egg color. So as I mentioned, as the egg is being formed from the female bird, just before it's laid, she creates the shell, the outer membrane of the egg, and deposits coloration in there. And there is some logic to the color of eggshells. Many species that lay their eggs in grassland or exposed areas are white, and birds that nest in cup nests in forests and woodlands are usually darker. The issue for, and one thing that the color does is it protects against UV radiation. So it stops UV light getting into the eggs and damaging them, damaging the DNA. But the more color you put in there, those eggs heat up faster. So you've got to also worry about the sort of competing heat that those eggs are getting. They might overheat. So typically in exposed areas where there's a lot of sun, the birds are most worried about overheating. And that's why those eggs are white. Whereas forest birds, where it's darker, they don't have to worry about a lot of sunlight heating the eggs up, and they pattern their eggs to prevent it.
So what about some birds that lay both brown and white, like chickens?
Oh, sorry, say that again?
So what about some birds that some of them lay white and some brown, like chickens?
Oh, yeah, I don't know anything about chickens. Is my pathetic excuse. I think it's hard when you talk about domesticated birds because they have different sort of, you've got different varieties and different, so there's a whole bunch of genes that are going on in domesticated birds that you just don't get in wild birds. So I suspect they've been bred for that color, or that they've been bred for something else, and that's associated with the color of the egg. So you sort of get these differences. And it may also be to do with what they're eating. So for example, the American robin has these bright blue eggs. We talk about robin blue. And that's from a compound that the bird releases that is sort of indicative of their state of health. So the healthier the female, the more blue the eggs are. And in fact, it's a sort of an indication for the male, what a good mate he has. Because they've done studies where amazingly, they've sort of changed the color of the robin eggs. So they've got ones that are very, very blue and ones that are pale blue. And the males try a lot harder when the eggs are really dark blue. So it's like they know these are really good young. They've got a really good mate. They've got these like super babies. And they're actually more engaged in looking after them and being a good parent than if they're kind of pathetically pale blue and kind of like these weak eggs. They're less excited. So the female has an incentive, sort of indicating her health, to produce these bright blue eggs, which sort of incentivize the male to do his job and look after them. So it's kind of interesting study.
Anita would like to know, how long can a bird hold the sperm?
I think about a month. Some birds might be longer than that, particularly around a month.
Okay.
And that's not unusual. Like from many, like snakes can do the same kind of thing. Insects can do the same. So it's not unusual in the animal kingdom to do that. Okay, so when the eggs are laid, most birds incubate them for about 2 weeks. So things like hummingbirds, 13 to 19 days. American robin, 10 to 14. So kind of around 14. So the bigger birds like red-tailed hawk might take about a month to incubate them. The longest is albatrosses, which could incubate their eggs for up to 80 days. So almost 3 months of sitting on an egg. Wow. And they have one egg they just sit on. Okay, so in general, it's the females that do the incubation. The female is usually sitting on the eggs in the nest, while the male is getting food and feeding her. So he's off finding food for himself and for his mate, and is feeding her while she sits on the eggs. Some birds will share that job. For example, woodpeckers have a nice kind of fair way of doing it, where the male does that at night and the female does that during the day. So they have shifts where they incubate the eggs. And to help birds incubate, they have what's called a brood patch. So they have these exposed areas of skin, like up to 3 of these areas. And you can see this easily on this bird. You just sort of blow back the feathers. That are highly vascularized. They've got a lot of blood vessels right under the surface, and that means they're very warm. So that skin is very warm to the touch, and that sort of transmits the heat from this bird or from the parent directly onto the eggs and helps to incubate and keep those eggs warm because it's sort of skin on egg. Both male and female have that.
Is that only during the breeding season or all year round?
Yeah, it's only during the breeding season. So they sort of develop that during the breeding season, and at the end of the breeding season, those blood vessels will sort of move back internally because obviously they're losing heat from that as well. So it's not great for to have that in the winter. So yeah, that will disappear in the winter. Okay, there are two types of young birds. Generally, two types of young birds. When we think about songbirds, these birds are called altricial, and that means for most birds, they're born weak, blind, naked, and they can't maintain their own body temperature. They look like this. These are kind of familiar nestlings that we see. They can't see, they can't move around, they don't have feathers, and they need to be incubated just like the eggs. So the female, after incubating the eggs, she's now incubating the nestlings. And the opposite of that, which is found with a lot of water birds and grouse and shorebirds, are precocial, which shares the same root as precocious. These are birds that are born essentially able to fend for themselves, like these little ducklings of the mallard. They come out of the nest, they come out of their egg, and their eyes are open, they're covered in feathers, and they can run around and find food. And they require a lot less care, obviously, than the songbirds, which take a while before they can see, before they can move around. Okay, feeding young birds. So popular among birds, you may have seen this, is regurgitation. So a lot of birds will regurgitate their food into their young, like pelicans. You can see this baby pelican excited about having a regurgitated meal from its parent. And doves do the same. Doves they have a sort of a unique sort of milky substance that they produce. They have a special sort of area in their stomach that produces this milk, and they regurgitate this for their young. Otherwise, birds are bringing back whole food. You can see this Atlantic puffin with a whole bunch of fish that's bringing back to the nest. And many other birds, like northern cardinals, will bring back insects or berries for their young. Many youngsters need continual feeding, roughly every 30 minutes. And for many birds, especially songbirds, that's insects. And especially caterpillars. Caterpillars are fantastic bags of protein. Caterpillars are really sort of like the ideal snack for birds to eat because they're quite big, they're full of protein and nutrition. So a lot of birds in the spring are looking for caterpillars, especially moth caterpillars. Spiders are popular. Some birds will feed their young seeds, but generally it's insects. And even for birds that for the rest of the year are feeding on seeds, for the young birds, they will feed them insects because they can grow faster because there's more protein in insects than seeds. So insects are very important part of the diet of almost all birds. And it says here that young American robins eat 14 feet of earthworms while they're in the nest. And that's not even their main food. They eat a whole bunch of other things as well. But in the course of everything else that they're eating, there's 14 feet of earthworms that go down their bill. It's a lot of earthworms. And parents are sort of incentivized to feed young because young make a lot of noise. So that kind of it reminds the parents they need to feed them, kind of like human babies making a lot of noise. Baby birds do the same, very loud noises. And they often have these kind of visual stimuli as well, like inside their mouth, their gape, which are often brightly colored, and that incentivizes or stimulates the adult to put food in there. This is a pretty remarkable gape. This is an Australian bird. We don't have this here. This is a bird that's in Western Australia called the Gouldian finch. One of the most beautiful birds in the world, like stunning. This is a male, really stunning coloration. And the young, you can see these are very young. Their eyes haven't opened yet. They don't have any feathers. And this is their mouth. This is what the inside of their mouth looks like, and that's a trigger for the adult to put food in there.
Wow.
Absolutely stunning.
Wow.
Yeah, I was doing some research for this class, and I hadn't come across this before, and I thought that was just amazing to see that. So, Yeah, Gouldian finch. But that's the extreme example. But just going back to like American robins, you can see this bright red here, and this is deliberate coloration. This is not just the flesh inside their mouth. It's deliberate coloration to stimulate feeding from the parents. Okay, so there's a bunch of things that the adults will do to defend their young. One of which is to sort of remove all hints or all clues that they might be nesting somewhere. So when the young come out of their eggs, they hatch from their eggs, you've got all these eggshells that are littering the nest. Rather than just toss those over the side, which is a big clue that there's a nest above, they will take each of these eggshells and then take them away to a location far from the nest to discard them. And they'll do that also with fecal sacs. So this is a fecal sac here. This is the waste that birds produce, which has very little water in it. Birds don't drink very much water, and they don't need as much water as we do. Partly because we need a lot of water because we eliminate our nitrogenous waste. Most of the nitrogen waste that we have, we get rid of in urine, which has a lot of water. It's a very water sort of product. Birds don't do that. They sort of precipitate that out into a solid, and they don't really need very much water for that. So these are quite dry. But anyway, this is a fecal pellet, and the bird is removing that from the nest. Sometimes you'll see birds doing this. They're sort of holding this white sac. And like the eggshell, they'll take that sort of to the edge of their territory or away from the nest so that the potential predators don't realize what's going on. Some birds are better at doing that than others. Woodpeckers are pretty unclean. So to start with, woodpeckers will often eat that fecal pellet because it has some protein in, especially since young birds aren't very good at digesting food. They get better, their digestive systems get better as they get older. So actually they don't absorb a lot of the nutrition in the stuff that they're eating when they're very, very young. So it makes sense for the adults to eat that because that still actually has quite a lot of nutrition. As the younger birds get better and they remove most of the nutrition from their waste, then the adult woodpeckers just leave that in the nest. So the nests get pretty foul, really. Woodpecker nests aren't particularly attractive. And that attracts mites, and probably is one of the reasons they don't come back there the following year, because they're just very messy. And birds will obviously defend their territory quite rigorously. If anyone's ever been near a red-winged blackbird colony, these are birds that black with these kind of red epaulets, these red shoulders, often in sort of marshy areas with reed beds. They can be very aggressive if you get too close to them. And one thing that's also common is mobbing of owls and hawks. This is where birds, even small birds, will sort of gang up on owls or hawks that are in their territory with the intention to drive them away. This is an eastern screech owl, which is awake during the middle of the day. And there are robins calling in the background. That chink, chink, chink is a robin. And there's an oriole that's just sort of flown in. And these birds will try and fly at the owl and make a lot of noise to sort of drive it away. The owl is trying to sleep, and it's having a hard time doing that when all these birds are making a lot of noise. So often you'll see hummingbirds involved in this, chickadees, nuthatches, a whole bunch of small birds that possibly on their own might not be able to take on an owl. But together they can drive it away, and they want to get that out of their territory. So that's eastern. Well, it's being dive bombed. So sometimes these smaller birds, like in this case the Baltimore orioles, are actually hitting the owl. They're flying right towards it, trying to knock it over, trying to push it away. And at some point, usually the owl just gives up and realizes that they're not going to be able to get to sleep, and they're not going to have any quiet time. All these birds getting very excited. So that process is called mobbing. And it's usually when there's an owl or a hawk in the neighborhood. Blue jays will do that, and crows will do that for owls as well, and hawks. And if you hear a lot of blue jays making a sort of raucous noise, or crows, then often there's an owl or a hawk in the tree. So these are really good clues for us in terms of finding hawks and owls. If you hear other birds making a lot of noise in one location, it's often an indication that you might have an owl or a hawk close by. Okay, so leaving the nest, which for many birds is hard to do. And there's obviously conflicting interests here because the young like have really no incentive to leave the nest. Kind of like human kids. You know, they're getting fed, they're getting kind of free accommodation. It's nice and warm. Everyone, you know, mum is bringing you food all the time. So they don't want to leave. And the adults obviously want them to go because, you know, I talked earlier about broods. So actually for many of these birds, they will want to lay more eggs and start all over again. So they want to get these young out. Sometimes they'll use the same nest. Sometimes they'll build a new one. But they need to be rid of these, you know, annoying youngsters who are just taking up all their time. So the parents will do a variety of things. They will withhold food. They'll stop feeding them to try and get them out. And they'll also use sort of different vocal signals to tell them that they need to leave. So they can be quite aggressive in pushing these young birds out. But there's sort of this interesting dynamic at that point where they both have very different objectives and conflicting interests. So leaving the nest.
So what age would the young screech owls leave the nest?
Oh, probably after a few weeks.
Wow.
Probably a few weeks old. And they actually do pretty well. So they'll hang like many birds. They will hang around the nest, outside the nest, and the parents will keep feeding them. But at least they're out of the nest, and they'll be teaching the young how to find their own food. But like many owls, you'll see them on branches. You know, you'll see a whole family group of them, of young birds, and the parents will be nearby. And it's a while before those young are really, probably all the way through the fall, really, before they're sort of independent on their own. Some birds, you know, they leave the nest. It's called fledging, leaving the nest or growing their flight feathers, and they're off, and that's it. For many birds, they will hang around. They're still kind of semi-reliant on the parent to bring them food, to teach them how to feed. They'll be watching the parents to learn how to find food. So it's not the end when the young leave the nest, but it's the beginning of the end. So that whole breeding cycle takes for many songbirds, about 4 to 5 weeks per brood. So if we think about the American robin, this is a young fledgling. This bird has just left the nest. And you can see it's kind of very sort of scruffy feathers. They are feathers, but they're kind of, these are the first feathers this bird has. And they still has some of these very young downy feathers. This bird hasn't even got a tail yet. It completely lacks a tail. And very kind of odd, sort of stubby feathers. Looks very different from an adult. So for an American robin, let's say, you know, on average they lay about 4 eggs. So the egg laying process takes 4 days. Remember, they laid 1 egg every day. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So 4 days for those 4 eggs to be laid. And then as soon as the 4th one is laid, they'll start incubating. Remember, it's the female that does almost all of the incubation, and that's about 2 weeks. And then when the young hatch, and they all hatch roughly at the same time, probably on the same day, because the female has waited until all of them have been laid before she starts incubating them. And then they all start, you know, the eggs warm up at that point, and they all start developing in sync. And they're in the nest for almost 2 weeks. For robins, it's about 13 days. And then they all leave pretty much on the same day. They'll all sort of fly out, at least within a day of each other, probably. So about 31 days for a robin. So about a month. And the breeding season for robins starts in April and goes all the way through to July, which is enough time to repeat this process several times. So typically robins will have 2 breeds. And if it's a good year, if they start early enough, it'll be 3 breeds. It'll be 3 broods. Robins will typically make a new nest for each brood. So they'll create a new nest for each of the clutches of eggs. Often the first one will be in a coniferous tree. If you think about it, in April, there aren't many leaves on trees in Massachusetts. So they're sort of reliant on, you know, they want to hide their nest. So they might, you know, build their nest in a coniferous tree that has leaves on it, in an evergreen tree. And then the second and third nests are usually in deciduous trees, where they're more at home. And at that point, you know, those will have leafed out and they will provide some security. But in April, you don't have much choice. There aren't many trees that have leaves. So they will change their nesting location, and for at least this species, they will change the type of tree as well. Okay, so that's what normally happens. But there are some people that cheat in this process. There are brood parasites that lay eggs in other birds' nests. This is brood parasitism, laying eggs in another bird's nest. And let's first talk about birds that do that with their own species. This is intra-specific. This is within the same species. And this is called egg dumping. So it may be that a female, has lost its mate, or she has more eggs than she can lay, but she'll dump eggs if she has spare eggs in another bird's nest of the same species. So there's a chance that those eggs might develop. And some species do this routinely. They produce more eggs than they can bring up themselves. So they'll just sort of liberally sort of spread them around other nests in the area and let other people bring them up. And it's obvious to you or to a bird if that's happening because suddenly there are more than 2 eggs arriving in a single day. Remember, most birds lay 1 egg a day. So if you suddenly have like 2 or 3 in a nest on a day, then it's because they've been dumped in there. These are 2 birds that routinely do this. Anyone know what the bird on the left is?
Wood duck.
Yes, and the one on the right?
Bluebird.
Bluebird.
Good job. Yeah, so wood ducks and bluebirds both engage in egg dumping. The females produce more eggs usually they can handle, and they will deliberately dump those eggs, lay those eggs in the nests of other wood ducks and other bluebirds.
So what's the reaction of the bird in the nest that gets the extra egg?
That's a good question. I don't know. That's a very good question. It's impossible for them to. In most cases, it's very hard for them to identify which eggs, if they can recognize that there are more eggs than there are supposed to be. And in many cases, it's thought that birds count the number of eggs they have. So if they leave the nest and come back and they see more eggs than they should have, then that sort of rings a bell, a sort of alarm bell. But it's unclear what they do about that because it's the same species, those eggs look identical, almost identical. It's thought that there might be some way that they can use infrared to sort of see some of the differences. But in many cases, they just have to incubate them because they don't know which ones are which. They're not sort of trained to recognize their own eggs or to sort of predict this. This is a common merganser. This is a photo, quite an incredible photo of a common merganser, which is a duck with 76 babies. And if you remember that most ducks, they're up to about 12 eggs, then there's a lot of egg dumping that happened in this female's nest. That's a ridiculous number of young. And, very few of those are her own. The vast majority of those young are from someone else, and probably multiple someone else's, because it's multiple other birds dumping other eggs in there. So, quite incredible. So that's intra-specific. That's within the same species. Okay, but probably this is more famous. Brood parasitism is more famous for the ones that do it in other species, and the obligate brood parasite. These are ones that only do this. Okay, it's not like they raise their own young. They only lay eggs in other birds' nests. And these birds have no nests themselves. They don't build a nest. They don't look after their own young. They delegate that responsibility entirely to other birds. Okay, they only lay their eggs in other birds' nests. And this is the classic example from Europe. Anyone know what this bird is?
The cuckoo.
It is the cuckoo. This is the common cuckoo. This is the European cuckoo. Really beautiful bird. It's called a cuckoo because when it sings, it goes cuckoo, cuckoo. And they lay all of their eggs in other birds' nests. Here, there's a cuckoo has laid an egg in a reed warbler. This is a small bird. It's a warbler that lives in reeds. And this small bird is not unfazed by the sheer size of the baby cuckoo, which is much bigger than it is. It looks entirely different than you might imagine a baby reed warbler to look, and it just doesn't know. It has no idea. So it has that sort of maternal instinct of feeding the young is so strong that it sort of blinds it to the fact that it's feeding this monster. So that's in Europe. We have examples here, and the most famous example in the US is this bird. Anyone know what this one is?
Cowbird.
Cowbird.
Yes, brown-headed cowbird. Because of their behavior, they're not particularly loved by birders. They do the same. They only lay their eggs in other birds' nests, and there have been up to 220 host species. So that's quite a large number of different species that these birds lay their eggs in. Some birds are pretty good at recognizing the eggs, like American robin and blue jay. So they see those eggs and they toss them out. Female cowbirds lay a lot of eggs in a season, up to 40 eggs, all in different nests. Even though most of those will fail, about 90% of those eggs will fail. The host will recognize them, and they get chucked out. Here's another warbler, like the previous slide. This is a common yellowthroat, and again, it's looking after this monster, which is much bigger and much different than a baby yellow throat would look. In many ways, this is really bad for the host species. So it's not just that they waste their time, but remember what I said about birds counting the eggs? So cowbirds are clever because they know that birds count their eggs. So they will wait until a female leaves the nest, that she has the eggs in the nest. She leaves the nest to feed, and she will jump in there and lay her egg very quickly, and she'll kick out one of the other eggs. And she does that because she doesn't want the bird coming back and going, oh, I've now got 6 eggs rather than 5. And even though that egg might look entirely different, it doesn't trigger a response because the bird is primarily counting the eggs rather than looking at the color or quality of them. So immediately they've lost 1 egg. Often, her egg, the cowbird egg, is further developed than the eggs in the nest, and that's deliberate, so that the cowbird hatches first. The young cowbird will then either kick out the other eggs, or when those eggs hatch, it will kill the host young, or it will just simply outcompete them for food because it's so big and it's so advanced that it will just eat all the food that the parents bring, and then the other young will die. So it's really bad if you're a bird and you have a cowbird in your nest, because essentially that's just like complete waste of time. You've lost pretty much all of your young. It really is devastating. So yeah, it is sad.
Well, I guess what you're saying, Neil, is that birds can be just as cruel as human beings.
Yes. But it's funny, we think that that's really nasty, but we look at birds like peregrine falcon and bald eagles, which kill other birds, and we think, wow, these are majestic, these are so beautiful, these are admirable birds. But like these despicable birds that lay their eggs in other birds' nests and delegate that responsibility, there's a lot of sort of interesting ethical stuff going on in how we value birds or interpret them.
Maybe that's how the ugly duckling story was made.
Yes. This definitely is the ugly duckling, the brown-headed cowbird. So next time you see brown-headed cowbirds, you'll know more about them now and know what they do. Before I leave brown-headed cowbirds quickly, they present a very interesting problem, because most birds learn the song that they're supposed to learn. Most birds learn that in the nest. They learn that from their parents. Their parents will sing that song to them quietly, or just as they leave the nest. And they have a window in time where they have to learn that song. If they don't, they won't be able to sing their song. And if you take young birds like young robins and you put them in a different nest, like a chickadee nest, those robins will learn the chickadee song, and vice versa. Okay, it's very plastic. Those birds are learning based on who their parents are. Except brown-headed cowbirds can't do that because their parents aren't around, so they cannot and do not learn the song of their host parents. Brown-headed cowbirds, when they leave the nest, they instinctively group together with other cowbirds, and then they learn their own special song in that group. But they do not learn it like all other birds when they're in the nest, which is kind of interesting because it's fascinating to me how a brown-headed cowbird knows that it's not. It knows that it's not the young of the parents that are bringing it up. It knows that it's not the same type of bird as them, and it shouldn't learn that song because it's different. It waits until later when it meets other brown-headed cowbirds and then learns the song.
So birds all have the same vocal aperture?
No. So yeah, I mean, it's not like if you put a robin in a chickadee nest, it will sing a perfect chickadee song because it's sort of predisposed with its own sort of vocal. It might be a lower pitch and slightly sort of harsher than a chickadee. Okay. But it will sound like a robin trying to imitate a chickadee. But it won't sound exactly like a chickadee. And sometimes you can hear these because birds do make mistakes, or they lose their parents and then they hear other birds nearby. So sometimes you'll hear birds singing the wrong song. It's because that's what's happened.
I have a question.
Yeah.
If you have a bird who lays an egg, lays eggs in a very dangerous area like a drain pipe or in your awning on a porch, and you can't open or close the awning, what do you do with the nest?
I guess it depends when you find it. If you can find it early on, then I would move the nest or destroy the nest, and then they'll rebuild it somewhere else. I mean, if they've got young in there, then if you can try and at that point it might be too difficult to move. So if there's any way you can sort of work around that until the young are out.
Because I have a place at Plum Island, and the birds are all over it. and they get into any little crevice or any, the top of an awning,
Yeah.
or even around an outside light.
Yeah,
They'll build them.
yeah, and they have no idea that might be used in a few weeks or it might be dangerous. So yeah, if you spot it early on, then you can move the nest or they'll rebuild somewhere else. Otherwise, if you can live
And
with
then
it,
what if the nest falls on the porch? Do you leave it, or do you pick up the birds, or what do you do with it?
if there are young birds inside, I would pick up the nest and put it somewhere safe. And if there are young that have fallen out of the nest, put the young back in the nest. It's most likely that those birds will die. They're not going to survive. But you can do a little bit, and maybe that might help. If it's a bird that's left the nest, a young fledgling, hopping around on the ground, then absolutely you should leave that. You shouldn't touch that because it's supposed to be doing that. It may look sort of defenseless, and largely it is defenseless, but it's worse if you get involved.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so just quickly wrapping up the breeding bird section, you can see birds that are sort of doing various aspects of breeding. So if you notice birds going to the same tree or shrub repeatedly, probably because they have a nest there or they're building a nest. If they're carrying nesting material, if you see twigs and branches, it's because they're building a nest. But the big clue is carrying food. Most birds will never carry food. They eat it as soon as they find it. If you see a robin doing this, it's because it's carrying food to its young. It's not carrying food to find somewhere else so that it can enjoy that meal. Birds are instinctive. If they find something to eat, they snap it up and they swallow it immediately. They're not carrying it around looking for somewhere else to eat it. They might lose that food. So if you see birds carrying food around, it's because they are bringing that to the young. And as we discussed, if you see birds removing eggshells with eggshells in their bill or fecal sacs, or if you find those on the ground, that's an indication that there's a nest nearby. And if you see newly fledged young, like this young robin, that are very scraggly with these kind of very sort of young feathers, some sort of downy feathers on them still, that suggests that you've had a nest close by. Those birds stick pretty close to the nest for the first few weeks.
Do birds stay and come back the following year to try to build a nest, a year later?
By and large, most of the birds will come back. Even birds that migrate all the way down to South America, they'll come back to exactly the same spot because they know that area. It's also hard for us to tell because most birds, we can't recognize individuals. It may be that you think you've got the same pair of robins coming back, but actually, next year it's a different pair. All the birds seem to know the best breeding locations. So if a pair fails or if they die, then it's immediately taken over by someone else. All the other robins know about that nest, and if it becomes vacant, someone else will jump in. And you may think that's the same bird coming back next year, but it may be, often it's the young of that bird or family members, because the family members tend to stay around the same area. So it's probably related to the original pair. Okay, I want to finish up by talking about how old birds are. So I had a great question about how old birds are and how old do birds live. And that is really a difficult question to answer because it's really hard to tell. Unlike humans, birds don't show physical signs of old age. So it's really hard to tell. If you look at a bird, you can't tell whether it's young or old. You can tell whether it's 1 year old or it's just come out of the nest. But once birds get into their adult plumage, they essentially look the same for the rest of their life. They don't go grey. They don't change like we do. They don't lose their hearing. They have perfect hearing as they get older. That stays with them. They don't lose their fertility. Very, very old birds still produce eggs. There are very few changes that older birds have that younger birds don't have. So we can't really tell by looking at a bird how old it is. It's hard to keep track of individual birds because they all look the same, unless you band them. So when ornithologists band birds, they put bands on the bird, these metal bands. We can do that, and then from that point on, when that bird was banded. But often you don't know how old that bird was when you added that band to it. So that's always a minimum age. If you recapture that bird later on, that gives you an indication of how old that bird is. This is the oldest wild bird. This is an albatross in Midway in Hawaii called Wisdom, and she was banded in 1956, which makes her at least 70 years old. She was probably at least 4 or 5, because she was in adult plumage when she was banded. So at least 70 years old. And she's still laying eggs. She's still producing eggs every year. And compared to other animals, birds are surprisingly long-lived. So this is a broad-billed hummingbird that in the wild, And birds tend to live much longer in captivity. Parrots do much better in captivity, for example, than in the wild. So in the wild, this bird lives 14 years. And you compare that to a house mouse, which is 4 times the size, and that only lives about 4 years in captivity. So even a tiny hummingbird, 4 times smaller than a mouse, is living much longer, and that's a mouse in captivity. The oldest dog in the world was 30 years old. It was an Australian dog, lived to 30. And that's nothing compared to a common raven, which can live at least 69 years. And because we know so little about birds, we've banded so few of them. The numbers that we're getting are probably not representative. They're probably birds that are much older than these. We just haven't been looking at those. Barn swallows. Barn swallows migrate every year. They can live up to 16 years. Found all the way across the Northern Hemisphere. In Europe, they migrate down to sub-Saharan Africa. For us, they migrate down to South America, the tropics in South America. And every year they fly about 14,000 miles there and back again. Okay, which, if you do that for 16 years, is 225,000 miles, which is about half the distance to the moon in the lifetime of this bird, which is a pretty incredible feat. There are trends in terms of how old birds live. Larger birds tend to live longer. Those with fewer chicks live longer. So if you waste all of your energy producing lots of young and having children, you don't live as long. And arboreal birds, birds that live in trees, tend to live longer than those on the ground, which might get predated by mammals more often.
A question: how do they die? Like, what happens when they die? Like, why?
Oh, yeah, that's a very good question. Very few birds die of old age. So most birds are dying because they've been attacked by something. Maybe they've flown into a window. They've got eaten by a hawk. So that's generally why most birds die. They don't die of liver trouble or cancer or heart attacks. They're dying because something is eating them or they've flown into something. So these two birds, wild turkey and red-tailed hawk. Wild turkeys live on the ground, which makes them not probably as long-lived as red-tailed hawks, but they're much bigger. But in fact, red-tailed hawks live about 30 years, and wild turkeys live about 15 years. So even though wild turkeys are 24 pounds compared to only about 3 pounds of a red-tailed hawk, wild turkeys don't live as long because they produce so many eggs, and that wears them out, producing having so many children, and living on the ground is a dangerous thing to do. So if you want to live a long life as a bird, don't have children and live in a tree. That's the message, which might be true for us as well. So here's these are some numbers, and again, these numbers are very unrepresentative because so few individuals have been studied. If you looked at 20 humans and you found the oldest one, that's going to be way short probably of looking at 1,000 humans and then finding the oldest one. So these are all probably significant underestimates. Flamingo, 49 years. Bald eagle, 38. Mourning dove, 30 years for a mourning dove. That's incredible.
Oh.
Blue jay is 26. So those are like the maximum, ideally maximum. But for the vast majority of individuals, they never get that old. Many songbirds live 1 or 2 years and that's it. Many robins will die in their first year. And for many songbirds, the probability of survival each year is about 50%. So every year there's a 50% chance that they're going to die. So you can see it's only a few that really get very old. Most of them are going to die in their first or second year.
Neil, are you aware of the article that just came out from the Smithsonian saying that in the mid-Atlantic, many of the songbirds have been dying, and they think it might be because they've been eating those cicadas that have a toxin, and they've eaten so many that it's killing them.
I was wondering who was going to eat all those cicadas. I was wondering if there were birds that would do that. I had not. So that was from the Smithsonian?
Yes.
Okay, I will. Thank you for that. I will look that up. I had no idea, but that's rather worrying. Are the cicadas toxic?
Yes, they are.
Yeah, that's a shame. Do you know which birds are eating them?
They were talking about the songbirds in the mid-Atlantic, so robins and blue jays and things like that.
Yeah. Okay, that's very sad. But yeah, thank you for that. I'll check into that.
There was also an interview with the scientist on NPR about that.
Oh, okay. I'll look for that too. Good, thank you. That's fascinating. That's good to know. Okay, I'm going to open this up for questions now. So let me.
I have a
I
mulberry.
have a question about bluebird.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question about bluebird houses?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I don't have a video of my camera. So my 2 bluebird houses blew down last week, Thursday in a storm. And when I looked inside, they had nests in them, but no evidence of eggs or babies. Do you think it's likely that the babies would have fledged already?
Oh, what is it now? End of July? No, beginning of July.
So
Yeah,
last week.
I would think they
So
probably
last
had.
week in Western Mass.
I would think they've had at least 1 brood by now. So I would expect them to be out of that. Yeah.
I have a
So what
mulberry.
should I do before I put them back up? Should I leave the nest or should I remove it?
I don't know. I don't know. I would suggest having a look online, see if there's any suggestions on that. I don't know what to do for bluebird nests. My concern is that it will get infested with insects, and it's better to clean it out. But I don't know if the bluebirds will come back and benefit from having a nest already. So I don't know if it will be detrimental to the bluebird to get rid of it. So I don't know. I would see if you can find anything online about suggestions for that. But I'm sorry, I don't have a definitive answer for that one.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
We have a question in the chat. What happens to dead birds? I very seldom see a dead bird.
That's a good question. Yeah, I rarely see dead birds. Often they're inside other animals, I think. So that's one reason why you don't see them, is that they're eaten by other things. And you might see feathers in places, if a hawk is eating them. But pretty much, birds provide a great meal for anything. So it's unlikely they're going to sit around in the wild for very long, because there are things that will eat them.
I have a mulberry tree, and you told us that the mourning dove is kind of lazy, but the mourning dove is the only one that eats the mulberries off the ground. All the other birds have to, careen into the branches, and their feathers are getting all mashed up with all the branches and all that, but they end up with maybe 1 mulberry and then they take off. Whereas the mourning dove, the 2 of them, they just plod along eating and eating and eating.
Yeah, and I don't know if it's bravery or stupidity for the mourning doves, because they don't mind they don't mind walking on the ground and getting a lot of their food on the ground. Whereas a lot of birds, for many birds, that's anathema. They're terrified of being on the ground because they might get eaten by something. But mourning doves.
And do they have color vision too? Because they know when to come in for the dark ones versus the lighter and the white ones. Mulberry.
Yeah, I think most birds have better vision than us, and they certainly have more color vision than us. They can see ultraviolet, which we can't see. So yeah, there are many more colors that birds can see than we can see. They have a wider spectrum.
Do they eat at a certain time of the day typically?
Most birds are more active in the morning, so they'll be feeding first thing in the morning and then before they go to bed, and then less so during the hotter parts of the day. So they're more sort of immobile during those times of the day. So they do most of their feeding early on and towards the evening.
Do they eat an equal amount of worms compared, like meat versus vegetables?
Oh, mourning doves?
Birds in general.
Oh, many birds are vegetarian, so they don't eat. Well, I guess I don't know if you count insects as animal. Well, okay, I don't know. So I wouldn't. I don't know how I'd classify that. Yeah, most birds are eating. There are very few frugivores. There are very few birds that only eat fruit. Most birds will eat insects. Some birds with heavier bills, like cardinals, will eat seeds because they can break the seeds. Goldfinches do the same. And goldfinches time their breeding for later in the summer when there are thistles out, the thistles that are releasing seeds, because they feed those seeds to their young. So they're sort of timing their reproduction to the availability of thistles. And there's, there aren't that many species that eat flesh. There are hawks, blue jays will eat, other birds. Hawks and
Frequently we see robins going for the worms rather than like a cardinal or other birds. That's interesting.
Yeah, robins are sort of designed for feeding on worms, and that forms the bulk of their diet. And they feed on worms by mimicking the rain. So when it rains, that sort of triggers a response in the worm to surface. So that the robin is pattering around on the grass, and it's mimicking the sort of the sound of raindrops on the grass, and that sort of causes the worms to come up, and the worms are coming up thinking, oh, there's some nice water up here, and then they get gobbled up by this massive robin monster that swallows them.
Thank you. That's interesting.
But no one else does that. It's only thrushes. So American robin is a thrush, like the European blackbird. Yeah, it's only thrushes really that do that.
I have a question on territorialism with hummingbirds. We have a feeder, and then we also have a lot of pretty bushes and flowers now. And there's tons of hummingbirds coming at us. How many would share a territory? Am I seeing the same ones over and over, or are there a lot of hummingbirds in there?
I think there are a lot of hummingbirds, and so they have this their territories where they have their nest, and then they have they sort of share feeding areas. So you can have a lot of hummingbirds that are coming from sort of adjacent territories that are all coming to the same patch to feed, and they have these sort of micro territories where they get very aggressive about individual flowers or individual parts of the feeder, and often you'll see hummingbirds trying to drive away other hummingbirds from that. They're always kind of very territorial. It's like they're always panicking that the feeder is going to run out and that they're not going to have enough food for later in the day. And they've got to stop other people from getting in there. There are a lot of hummingbirds around. There was a hummingbird expert in California. I can't remember his name, but I remember this is an anecdote. I remember someone telling me that they went out birding with him, and he bans hummingbirds, and he spends his life looking at hummingbirds. And they were in this kind of like small wooded area. And he said to this guy, the hummingbird expert said to this other guy, how many hummingbirds do you think you can see, or do you think they're here? And the other guy had heard a couple of hummingbirds. He said maybe 1, 2, 3. And the other guy said, okay, well, there's one there. And he had 100 that he sort of was peripherally aware of. There are just vast numbers of them that we just don't see and we're not aware of. It's really hard to spot hummingbirds when you don't have feeders. If you sort of walk around and they're there, but you just have no idea. They're so small, so cryptic. But yeah, and maybe these are waves of birds that are coming through, so they're not always the same birds that are coming back every day.
Mm. And also territorialism of hawks and vultures. Do they keep that territory for a whole season? We used to see tons of hawks in our immediate area. Now they're gone. Then the turkey vultures were circling around all the time, and now they seem to be gone. And they'll last a month or two and be gone.
Yeah, I guess it depends. It depends on the type of food that if it's not producing food, then they won't bother hanging around. So yeah, it's probably an indication of the quality of the food. But that's a good point about territories changing. So robins have a winter territory and sort of a fall territory, which is tiny compared to their breeding territory. But they'll be defending a patch of food for the winter period that's much smaller than their breeding territory. And some birds will do that. They'll have a big breeding territory, and then they'll have a different territory for the winter.
Thanks.
I wonder, what is your opinion on feeding the birds in the summer? Keeping the bird feeders up?
That's a really good question. And it's a controversial one, because there are people that think it's a good idea. There are people that think it's a bad idea. I think the strongest argument I've heard birds are wild animals. They should be able to survive on their own. So there should be enough food for them out there. The strongest argument I've heard for not feeding birds is what you are actually feeding when you're feeding birds. So you may think you're feeding cardinals and all these other birds, but primarily you're feeding house sparrows. And house sparrows are invasive birds. They're not supposed to be here. They were brought over from Europe in about 1900. They're cavity nesters, which means that they nest in bluebird boxes. They take over nest sites that other birds need, other cavity nesters need, chickadees. And they breed just incredibly through the year. They have multiple broods, 8, 9, 10 broods. They can breed all the way through the year. So indirectly, by feeding everything else, you're sort of giving a competitive advantage to house sparrows because you're feeding the house sparrows, and those house sparrows are detrimental to everything else. So probably if you could avoid feeding house sparrows, then I think it's probably a good idea. But I've not heard anything that suggests that birds need to be fed. I think the important thing about feeding birds, I guess as a bird watcher, for me, feeding birds is important because people love seeing birds in their yard, and that inspires them to care about birds, to join organizations that and to donate money to groups that buy land and are involved in conservation. So indirectly, that love of birds translates into something that we do in terms of looking after birds. I think that's probably a bigger impact than the individual birds that you feed, which could survive anyway.
Right. I was a bit concerned because in central Massachusetts, there have been reports of birds with eye disease and other dead birds that they are afraid come from contaminated feeders.
Yeah, that's a separate issue. So, and that's an issue with house finches. So house finches are these they're like red sparrows. They have like bright red faces and then red breasts, sort of brown on the back. House sparrows are also an introduced species, but not from Europe. They're introduced from the US. These are birds that their original territory was in the Southwest, in Arizona, New Mexico. And they were kept as cage birds because they have a nice song. And they escaped from a New York airport in like the 60s or 70s. And they've taken over for the East Coast, to the extent where a bird that was very similar to house finches that's called the purple finch. And if you buy bird seed, you may see pictures of purple finches on there. Purple finches used to be very common here, and they used to be very common at bird feeders. And now purple finches are very, very rare because they've been sort of ousted by house finches. Anyway, house finches have this unique eye disease, this sort of conjunctivitis that they get. That's a bacterial disease, and it's passed with dirty feeders. So if birds come to a feeder and you don't clean the feeder, you get this bacteria that builds up, and other birds catch it. So your feeder is essentially acting as a sort of reservoir for this disease. And you can see these birds with really horrible deformities. Their eyes close up. They have these big growths on their faces. It's pretty depressing to see. But that's pretty much limited only to house finches, which you could argue shouldn't be here in the first place. But one thing with feeders is you should be cleaning them. You can't leave a feeder up the whole season and it's going to have bacteria. It'll have mold. It'll have diseases. So you should regularly, be cleaning it.
Okay, thank you.
Earlier in your talk, which I enjoyed very much, you at times described bird behavior as instinct, and another attribute you said think. And it jars my sense of biology to think of instinct and thinking as so different. But there is now a new, very popular research field in neurology. The nervous system is developing in a certain way. Of course, all the birds are doing that, have to, but the general term is neuroplasticity. And in neuroplasticity, the neurons or the axons, the fibers of the bird's brain, mainly the brain, it wouldn't qualify as instinct, and it wouldn't qualify as anything more specific. So is the field of is neuroplasticity a concept that's used in brain of nervous system of brain of birds?
I think so. I think so. There are a lot of studies in terms of learning, of understanding how birds learn, and the sort of the plasticity involved in learning, and the birds have much better ability to learn than we have really given them credit for in the past. So the little I have read on that would support what you're saying in terms of this is there is sort of intricate brain development ongoing through a bird's life that is dictating how it makes decisions.
Yeah.
And yes, I apologize if I loosely use those terms in the sort of instinct of a bird, and then thinking.
It's not at all meant to be a criticism of the way to use the terms, and there's certainly some terms merge in some degree, but I think it's going to be possibly an important avenue for research, neurophysiology research, because the concept neuroplasticity is very much on the minds of neurologists.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a fascinating topic.
Okay. Wow. Thank you, Neil. Wow.
We've gone from infidelity and